It's just, it keeps going red. I don't know. Sucks. Okay, but it's picked up again, so we'll go share, copy.
Just redo that process next time too. I'm guessing.
Yeah, we'll see. It seems fine for now.
Okay, so let's continue with the picture. As I had requested. Neurotically.
Right.
Psychotically.
Appropriately. If nothing else.
Yeah, so that is a reflection of the fact that aspects and subjects can fully be implemented within the concepts of types if you do it manually. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, right. You're talking about the layering of languages, and that the simpler fundamental pieces are always coming together to speak new words and objects at new layers. That's why we have 3 set up, 3.2.5, 3, whatever.
Yeah. So that's that.
3.5.
Now, the next thing to notice is that space is a concentric organization of subjects. Subject within subject within subject within subject.
Wait, what?
What's wrong?
No, just subject.
Look at the picture and let's talk about it. You were looking at your phone, man. Come on.
Oh, yeah. Well,
don't you think I'll give you shit for it? I'm joking. But it's like a mountain peak, right? Everything. Mm-hmm. So you have these concentric subjects building up, and everything that happens between types through aspects happens at a peak. Now, the thing that I added to this picture is to this picture of you having multiple peaks.
Yeah.
And here's
like
the
mountain range, if you will.
And here's the thing. If you're on this peak and something happens, you can actually wind up being on a completely different peak. Teleported, if you will. So the concentric circles underneath you are of a completely different substance.
Yeah,
maybe some of them repeat, but at different locations.
I've noticed and experienced that. It's within almost the very next moment you're in a different space, but you're in the same environment, but it's like the subject changes
so you're,
instantly.
So when you're climbing
shocking.
when you're climbing back down, you could potentially be climbing from a higher peak, or from a lower peak, or from a completely different peak, or from a peak composed of exactly the same subjects but in a different order.
Right, and again, we're just generically describing the process of experience of reality.
Right, because the inner squares inside the subject, whenever they do their thing, they also wind up redefining the peak. Potentially. Not always, but potentially. Like, obviously you will have stability in some sense.
Mm-hmm. But you need this motion all over the place because the map it's always changing what we experience, so where we're going, what we're doing.
A lack of ability to maintain stability, for example, could be seen as what is showing up in mental illnesses. The peaks that the subjective peaks at which a person appears don't necessarily do not continually correlate to the actions of the types and the subjects on the peaks. So when you start to have the disconnects and going in these and those directions, that's the operating system being hijacked, of course, by either the system or something else, but is still relevant to the system.
There's a sort of way of detecting this, I guess. It seems like you would be able to self-analyze these peaks for their isomorphism with what's in your context.
And notice how this comes up in the programming languages as programmer errors. If you are in the peak you're not expecting to be, the way you've set the overall
like a peak of meaning is what we're talking about here.
Right.
Of stacks of meaning.
A peak is the innermost subject in which whatever representational computation is taking place. It defines the context.
Mm-hmm.
the full context of the computation. So the outermost circle sets up the stage. The next circle adjusts that stage according to the setup. The next circle is supposed to make this even the most concrete aspect of it. Like, say, in this case, I chose 3 because archetype model guild. The archetype is the subject, the outermost subject that doesn't have definition. The model gives
Right.
definition to the types
And I was gonna say
presents
that
the aspects.
this mountain range, if you will, should be viewed holonically, in that it's not static rings of meaning latched onto each other, but
Composed.
there's got to be another word.
Like
Composition.
you can take any one circle
Like there is
switch
a
it with the other circle.
there is a sort of what you could see as a dependency chain in the language itself, in that when you speak a word on one level, it's literally broken down into the language below.
What you want the skill is basically when you get to the point of where you have just types and aspects and subjects are already done their job, you're at the peak. What you want to do is have the skill to know which peak to put what types and objects into. So the skill is in negotiating the structure of this subjective mountain range, if you will, so that you're setting up your quote unquote teleportation gates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like
according to a specific protocol.
A sort of accumulation of pointers. If your mountain has been created well, it has these pointers coming down that come with you and tell you how to come back down.
I just realized something that is so fucked up. Portal Mountain is showing up as an image for what this is, because what we're literally are saying here is that within each subject, because you can negotiate what the stack of subjects is when you're coming out of that calculation, is that you can formulate a teleportation mechanism from peak to peak to peak to peak to peak to peak, contextualized. Doing this skillfully,
right?
Because
Because
the metaphor.
You're always going peak to peak, so to speak.
Anyway, but the skill isn't doing that.
But some peaks
purposefully
are not as high as others, you could say, or is something.
Which itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It could just not.
No, yeah, it's a bad way of saying it. There's unskillful peak.
Here's a low peak, the computational part of the language. So your primitives, your ints, your bools, that's like your. If you stay at that,
Right,
if
I was
that's your
thinking
peak,
of it in
it's
a-
broad, right? The
That's
peak is
kind of
broad.
a non-judgmental way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's like a
Right.
cave system that doesn't mean anything.
But there's a quality aspect to it, and I don't mean to say the height of the mountain on the range, because we kind of associate the more fundamental with the lower, the more basic, the base. Like it's broad, bases are broad.
It's about not.
But there's a quality,
quantifying it.
because we're always at the peak, right? We quote unquote. There always is a peak. It's not a skill of going from one peak to another peak. It's a skill of which
So,
peak is
I think-
which one should you go to?
I think
Because there's many.
I can simplify what you're trying to say. I think the quality of the peak isn't correlated to the quantity of subjective layers that go into the peak itself to make it quote unquote higher. If we were to look at the subjective layer as a measure of height,
Mm-hmm.
right? The height of the peak is not correlated
But languages can build and build and build, and in fact, if you look at hierarchy of corporation, making the pyramid of ego, it's actually it can become way very tall in its complexity, in which what management speaks down to their subordinates, the complexities of the company.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it's isomorphic.
It's so in this case we're seeing a direct correlation of quality to quantity, the corporation scenario you just described, whereas we are not saying that quality and quantity in the stacking is correlated at all, because the layers of subjectivity that are involved are purposeful. The quality is in the navigation,
Right, and
not in the heights.
And simplicity is better in some ways. I guess that maybe it's yeah.
which is why we're not going to eschew programming to begin with and use programming to actually make the point.
Right, and simplicity can be taken in two ways. One is like, oh, just do what you're told. It's that simple. That's all you do is just do what you're told. You slot into the hierarchy as an ego. That's simple, quote unquote. It's also simple to be on the other side of this.
Notice something though. How few words are involved in this particular simplicity.
Just do what I say. Oh, it's so simple.
And so little meaning.
It's
as in
meaningless.
None.
Yeah. You just do what they say, literally.
That's to speak to the point I was making earlier about uncertainty. Are we ready to move on? Do we understand this well enough to we don't need to really focus on the narrative part that formulates the string of moments, but if
actually,
we want to...
I was just interested in reviewing kind of what we were talking about the languages last time.
Yeah.
Kind of go through that. So
I went
are
all
we
the way
at version 2 now? That's language 2, and we...
So yeah, subjects and aspects give it as the secondary version, if you will, because those can be reconstructed in terms of pure types.
Right.
So if you do it right, it's just going to be much more wordy.
And that's kind of the point here again. So we're language stacking. We're stacking these domains. It's
you can rewrite
according to the Holonic
You can
model.
rewrite basically. You can rewrite aspects and subjects in pure types.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reiterate
in object-oriented languages.
When we're speaking in a higher language, that's what I meant by it's literally a composition of other things at a lower language.
To put it into even more of a concrete sense, you can write object-oriented language entirely through
functional
procedurals.
Procedural, right?
So you don't even have to have an object-oriented language to do object-oriented programming. It's just what it's going to do is make you type a lot.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to reduce.
Yeah,
we're trying to condense the amount of typing into the expressions that are being sold. And the expressions are so standardized that it's like ridiculous not to just build them in. So
no sense in leaving this to any of it to question. Just nice, easy user interface.
So the 0.5 element of this language actually belongs to any part, any level of it. So 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, whatever. It's the point. The 0.5 just indicates that there is an expectation testing utility. So for whatever feature you're doing. So if you're trying to do,
interesting how you just phrased that. So being 0.5, that kind of implies the top coming down. That there's always a 0.5, 1.5, 2.5. You could always introduce a testing facility to that one version. The 0.5 is what comes down to testing.
So the literature about types and all of those kinds of expectations that we already know from normal languages, that's already settled. You just need to have good keywords to express it, right? Expect it to equal whatever. What is it? It is defined by the test class we're testing. Just make an it for me. Oh, you need more parameters? Here's some default parameters.
Filling in the stuff that doesn't need to be said, that goes without saying.
Yeah.
That, once again, I'm pointing to the fact of languages stacking on top of each other. If you're speaking in a higher, more significant language, it's utilizing the building blocks of the more fundamental directly below it to communicate down the stacks.
Right, so if it's utilizing that, it's got to ensure that it passes its expectations, right? I'm the one patterning you. Are you patterned correctly? That's basically what it's asking.
Great.
Your features on your level are all patterned correctly for you. Are they patterned correctly for this next level concept? So you do this with types, you do this with then you do this with aspects and subjects, and that's your 2.5 there. And then the next level is the domain, the expression of domains themselves.
Okay, so you're talking about language 3 now, right?
So this language.
Oh yeah, sorry, just checking the monitor.
Yep. So this language, much like its predecessor of subjects and aspects, where you can rewrite everything in terms of types, where you can rewrite everything in terms of just data structures and procedures. This language takes the subjects, the aspects, and the types concepts a step further and adds a way to use them in a very standardized way. So make types in this pattern. Make types in that pattern. So this is your entity, this is your value. It's you create a type in this specific set way. An entity will always have a unique identifier by which you can recall it back from persistence.
Right. Now I'm remembering this from last meeting. This idea of the entity as a thing that's kind of persisting over time.
Now, persistent over time could be in memory, but persistent over time could be in database, and all of those kinds of things.
And
so how and where it's persistent makes
it's
difference.
Creating a uniquely identified object, right, within the system. Like would have a UUID, you could say, or equivalent.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter what the properties values have been changed to over that speck of time. That only influences the way it responds to the environment further down the line.
We're introducing a persistence over time.
Yeah, it's always respected as something that comes back.
So this makes me think, like maybe it would be interesting to go and look at the narrative portions of this chart, because isn't that what we're adding now with the idea of the entity? We're getting into the narrative, the story of a thing being persistent over frame over frame over frame. You have the space, yes, but now you have the
we're
time.
Basically like 2 languages below being able to do that. This is not this. We do this when we're encountering a new domain. We don't do this when we're working with an existing domain, because all of this would have been defined.
You're talking about integrating, I guess.
New stuff, adapting. So when you're adapting, you're obviously going down layers to build back up.
Right.
Right. So you'd have to jump back down to the domain defining language to say, okay, what are we talking about? Okay, how are we talking about it is the next language.
Right.
And then what are we doing with how we're talking about it is the third language that we're actually doing anything with.
Okay. And you're reminding me here of like archetype model guild.
Yes.
Like program protocol.
How interesting that this should come up from the bottom up.
Yeah. So like that the perception mechanics stuff, seems like that's coming through in the final layers of this language.
Yeah, the domains that have already been defined, with the ability to jump back down a layer if you need to redefine a domain in a domain. So that's what the perceptive is good at, is jumping down whatever language layer they need to do that thing. Even down to the computation of like just saying, hey, let's use logic here. If this is true and this is true,
right,
what follows? Right? Like it's not beyond that. That's why you have a lot of debates in Tibetan Buddhism. Actually, a lot.
Right.
It's like an accepted part of the meditation.
And to put yourself out there and to be wrong is fine. Like you gotta kind of be beyond that.
And to see that 2 opposing ideas could, on a different scale or a different
maybe they slot into different domains where they make sense.
Right. So if you have 2 different peaks, and you have a third peak that is a combination of the peaks, subjectively speaking,
then you can both come to that harmonized agreement.
So on the 2 peaks you have opposing views. On the third peak you have conflated views. Not conflating, but
composed,
unopposing views.
Sure.
You know what I mean? This is like back to this diagram.
Common views, shared views.
This happens, for example, in physics, where you have a particle and a wave. If you're looking for particles on the particle peak, all of the experiments show particles. We know this. We have another peak of subjectivity that treats everything as waves, and we know for a fact that particles are waves. And then there's a whole bunch of other peaks that treats the subject as a transmutation of one another, one of which is, say, string theory. Right? Like you have
trying
all
to
this,
encompass both views to pull in the dialectic or whatever.
and it's not like the string theorists are sitting on this peak or that peak, but it's not like the subjectivity layering of this peak is apart from any of those. They're built upon the same shit. String theory is built upon the
Right.
stuff that you're observing in the nucleus.
I think interestingly, a lot of the arguments that we have or disagreements can easily be broken down towards the fundamentals and just build back up, like in sharing of common denominators.
Or in other
our
words,
values.
a skillful navigation of subjectivity mountains, or
Right.
the subjectivity range.
So it's like we both walk up to each other with our own mountain ranges all coming together. And it's like
So-
a game of chess.
I don't know if you recall this, but subjectivity has usually been coupled usually with the stupidity spectrum.
Subjectivity?
In general, like underneath you have the subjectivity layer,
Yeah.
and on top you have basic spectrum of subjectivity, which is sorry,
There is a subjective and an objective end to that.
right.
Objective being scientism, philosophy.
No, that's
mix.
that's the part above. That's the stupidity spectrum.
I thought that's what you're talking about.
But then underneath it is the subjectivity spectrum, which is more to do with
Like proximity.
the subjectivity spectrum is strictly just the division between objectivism and solipsism itself, without the second layering of making quadrants out of it.
Right.
So the subjectivity
Rings a bell.
is just what the quadrants are made out of.
Like the two sides,
Right.
if you will.
And so in our discussions it's often just flipped around into the stupidity spectrum, but here we're seeing something very different. This quote unquote mountain range of subjectivity, which needs to be skillfully navigated like a portal mountaineer. And
It's like
with regards to and this is the thing, with regards to the portals, the skill is to understand where on each peak there is a portal to any other peak. So the image of Portal Mountain is also materializing in the description of the skillfulness of navigating
So like
the subjectivity
it's
spectrum.
it's almost as if when you're standing on one portal, you're looking on the mountain range, you'll see some portals are bigger than others, maybe. And what that could represent is like their isomorphism up and down the stack of the significance and the isomorphism of the map with the terrain kind of idea.
If you're skilled,
that portal looks bigger.
no. This
to
is
see it.
this is a skill. The
You
size.
see what I'm saying though?
If you were to say the quality of the portal is based on its quantified size, then what will happen is that the
No.
the skilled
It's
people,
seen as size, but what it is the isomorphism, the degree of isomorphism up and down the stack, that mountain.
right. And then what I'm trying to point out is that for the person entrapped within the stupidity spectrum,
They would think more stuff accumulates to make a bigger portal.
and the portals that they will see as bigger are not the ones
Right.
that are skillfully
Yeah.
navigated through the other paths, if you will.
Right.
So seeing the size of the portal in the right way, quality to quantity, if you will, is the skill. And if you don't have the skill, what you'll get is a mangled version of the size of the portal, and you'll gravitate towards not necessarily you will not gravitate towards the smaller ones, which actually are the bigger ones in retrospect.
I like that.
That's the
Kinda went
coherence
there.
element. That's where coherence can be found.
And I like the idea too that we can practice a lot of this. We can encounter little sound bites that actually increase our vision of this mountain range.
And we can actually segue into the next subject of uncertainty with this. Because the more you step through portals to see what happens,
fucking around,
the more you fuck around with this system in terms of that, of stepping through portals and watching what happens,
right?
The more you
find out,
the more the sizes of the gate of said portals will reflect
the isomorphism.
The less time you spend on it, the less they'll reflect. This is the uncertainty.
In fact, opposite. It's a complete opposite because of charlatanism. The portals will look bigger due to dysmorphism.
Right.
Through the typical ego reward punishment mechanism.
But the point there would be is that the more dysmorphism you go through as trying to gain skill, the more dysmorphism will be of representative as pain.
You're gaining an experience.
And so the reward will come from not doing that. There is obviously your local minima in which people get stuck. But
you're talking about having had gone through enough stress in life, for an example, that you're just fed up with it and you need to find a different way to go. Even though you know it's painful, but
to the point where you can qualify it in a way that makes sense to you, which means you can do your categorization of it in a way that actually reflects something that it's representing.
Right, and this is, I guess, a spiritual journey.
The more you keep expressing it in that term, the more you actually build up.
It's hard to say how people get onto that, or like what finally motivates it, or
I don't know about hard. Ignorance is the predominant feature of, say, Buddhism and Hinduism and all.
Right, just causing so much pain that after
just
a while,
not knowing. You come into this world as a child not knowing, and you're being taught by people who did not learn.
Right. So this is that should be extra painful, you would think.
I made a comment on Facebook the other day, a couple of weeks ago, I think. We've given up the ability to learn from our elders to the ability to have ourselves reviewed by our peers. Unfortunately, our peers are on the same fundamental level of stupidity as we are, and therefore it's a shit show.
Right, of course.
So that chain being broken down of elder to youngin',
right,
is a fundamental
issue
with that.
That's a huge break from normal tradition, if you will. That's what tradition itself could be said to be. Is that people who know and have learned the hard way have a way of conveying that through symbol to the younger generation.
And it makes sense that when you're a part of a society and your physicality is no longer there,
it's a shit show.
Your part of society isn't there for the physical part. It's for the tradition, the laying down. All of that accumulated into. You have been physical all your life, and now you're done. What is the final message of that transformation? We don't have that anymore because nobody listens to any of that. They're just talking to the same people and entrapped into the same fucking web of trying to figure it out. Who are too busy to do anything with it or listen to anybody who has anything to say about it.
Right, and so civilization is, the market has kind of atomized us to such an extent where this idea of specialization, that we each do our own little part, but we never learn the general things. And so we're so susceptible in so many domains in which the languages are no longer spoken. Like, those are the real languages we've lost. All that's left is a charlatan to prey on that ignorance, right? And the fact that we don't have like tradition, if you will, as defined here, we don't have that to provide us with what's worked in the past. Like, just, until I understand it, give me some routines to follow, some protocols so that I won't fuck up bad. Like
So that I don't
never
get
walk
punished.
through a dark alley
So
or
I don't get punished.
all this kind of stuff, right? Like life lessons that your elders would
Because
teach.
the other thing is that pain is associated with punishment. Pain is the reflection of the activity. Punishment is taking a pain as the experience and putting it into a neurological context of saying I have been pained because such and such and such.
Right,
and
right.
such.
Yeah. You're talking about the hook,
Yeah.
the linchpin of the ego, if you will, through reward and punishment
Right.
systems.
So
Hijacks your cognition and inserts its own narrative in front of what's actually happening.
So
in
the thing
moment.
about this is that pain and pleasure are not avoidable.
Right.
Punishment and reward are a
Right.
matter of
The contextualization.
The contextualization. And to top it all off, is that the way it's rigged is to utilize pain and pleasure to expressly express reward and punishment in the narrative, such that you can formulate the tether. This is unconscious stuff. So this is not nobody's planning to do this. This is just the way it works itself out. So the tether becomes the anxiety of the future in terms of avoidance of pain that one is correlating with the past. The interesting thing about the setup is, and we see echoes of this in modern social networks, is that the past comes back to haunt you over and over and over again in a way that all your future formulations of the future itself are in terms of the past events.
Right.
So if you're in debt,
Like a
then
crystallized sort
Yeah.
of structure.
you're the criminal, you're the harlot, you're the
Right.
this and that.
Yeah.
And the other.
And this, I think, is why, there's such a, in Christianity, for example, is such an emphasis on forgiveness of your sins, for example, that ability, we need this ability in modern day to break from that crystalline structure of punishment.
And it's the same statement that could be said about karma. Karma seems to be like that thing that follows you through time, right? And again, by trying to analyze all of this stuff, it's like we're trying to break away from how
In
this,
Buddhist terms, karma would be the same sort of structure that we're pointing at.
original sin, you're indebted. Karma, you're indebted.
Right.
This all follows from an observation of that. Point needs to be made that institutionalized versions of all of these things reaffirm the debt, right? Like they will try to paint the picture in such a way that the debt is justified.
In other words, the charlatan will
Because you can
continue
benefit from
this.
it.
Right. Even subconsciously, unconsciously. It's not like you have to think you're betraying God or anything.
Well, the other thing is about this is that charlatans appear from charlatanism.
Right.
That's the only way.
It's
they
the
come into
reaction.
the picture.
It's a reaction to itself.
It might be. So you know how I had the two levels? It's very likely. I haven't thought this through yet, but it's very likely that when the first level pressures the other level, the reactionary one.
You're talking about our conversation about reacting to
So
charlatanism.
callousness and malice. Then you got your adversary, which is not necessarily a charlatan, but just a reactionary. But like those two are charlatans. And so what I'm saying is that the callous one manifests
The other two as
the
henchmen.
adversarial one,
Right.
and the adversarial one, if engaged long enough, become callous and continue the cycle.
Right.
So at first you're just reacting to the right, but eventually you become, a hater of anybody who doesn't agree with whatever version of what you have in mind.
It's like the dark side takes over.
It's becoming the thing you hate.
Right. tragedy. We'll be right back.
Let's keep going.
Yeah. Do we want the chart?
Mm-hmm.
Still helping?
Well,
So we were talking about, I don't know if,
the most fundamental aspects of the APS at this point.
right?
We touched on subjects like what Portal Mountain is, based on this, which was an incidental but
Yeah, I like
but
that.
very interesting coincidence.
Like, that's our mythological development right
Yeah.
there for the day.
That we didn't use this to come up with, so that was nice.
Mm-hmm.
We also kind of touched on the fact that the spectrum of subjectivity can be flipped around and looked at the spectrum of stupidity, or if you don't do that and stick around in these terms over here, it's about skillfulness and coherence.
This to me feels like a stacking of language situation again. Once again, we're coming down to a more fundamental domain. That's all that's needed to deal with this. You don't have to go more.
Yes, but this domain has to build up to the other domains and connect with them. And now we're going to tackle that. And this is the step we started with just a moment ago. We started talking about entities.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we're carrying on with our language stack.
Yeah.
Down.
So we're departing from the peak here in terms of nomenclature. Right. So an entity is a particular kind of type.
Right.
A value is a particular kind of type. So we're stepping away from this nomenclature, but this nomenclature is actually behind the scenes of what we're talking about.
Right.
So that's why it's a particular kind of type, right? It's an entity is a type, but we're going to now extend the meaning and continue on.
Right.
And this wouldn't appear here, but
So
this is what moments would do to drive the reconstruction of types and subjects and aspects.
So again, and this is something we weren't going to bring up or whatever, but the fact an entity is a thing moving through time. So this, to me, as I was saying earlier, reflects this. The whole of the narrative, you require a sequence of kind of snapshots of space. If you will.
What you want to say basically that if it was like a dot on that membrane, the elastic membrane, the rubber balls in the rubber kind of thing, in the concrete, which is where the spectacle is taking place. Right. What you want to say is that as you're moving from box to box to box to box, you will want to see an evolution of the dot moving, like you would say in a scene from a movie,
right.
or a film of a movie, shot by shot by shot by shot.
Right. And when you do that, most shots, you can actually watch pixels
Animation.
move. Right?
Yes, that's. I'm hoping that's what you meant with that. So is you're seeing a string of squares.
And what I like, the fact of entity is what triggers me to think about this, because an entity is a thing existing through time. It changes through time, right? So, not just the space, the description of space itself.
This is correct, except that in the actual spectacle, you're seeing a value, and that value represents an entity or a value. And that represents, you know what I mean? Like, even if it's an entity, it could be represented by the value of its UUID, which can be passed around just as a value, as a number. And then eventually you take that UUID and it's like, oh, what's the entity associated with that? Right? In a different space altogether. So you can jump around like that. So what you want to be seeing in that is some kind of consistent thematic pattern of the entity moving through space over time, right? So space being represented the location in the square.
Right. When you say moving through space, we're talking like almost ontologically,
yes.
in its shape-shifting of its very meaning of what it is through time.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Now, to get that to that point, so the language used inside of here, if you will, is going to be entities, values. So entities are like the things that move through time, and the things that are timeless are values. A 5 is a 5 is a 5 is a 5. It doesn't matter where in the timeline it shows up.
And those are what, just values, is that what you said, or what?
Yeah. So
right.
That's the difference between entities and values. That's what allows us to arrange things into aggregates and denote the unchangeable parts of the system with the changeable parts of the system. So values don't change, entities change. So a 5 appears as a static thing in that universe. The thing that uses the 5 is the thing that changes over time.
This reminds me of an ontology.
It's exactly that.
Right.
It's exactly that.
Having that which is assumed to exist and be real. That's your values, right?
Tableness versus tables. Right? Types are like values.
Right.
Whereas instances of types are your entities.
And this is once again we see the heavens and earth combining
You can't have one without the other, really. Like, you don't have any meaning given to types without their corresponding instances that are doing the work themselves.
Right. And this is ideally where, in the programmer stack, things can come up that you would never expect, because our programs, as we write them, need to sense in the environment, like take in the earth, if you will, like from below.
Yeah. What if
to change what even exists?
Am
right?
I running on gravel? Am I running on concrete? Am I running on mud? Am I running? I'm running. I'm doing the same motion, ideally.
Or like.
But it has a very different effect on me.
Or like when you try running on a surface you've never ran before. Like you said earlier, we come down to the more fundamentals of. Yeah, open that over here a little bit.
I was more confused about which.
Yeah. But yeah, the ability to adapt and change by kind of retreating back to the more fundamental context or subjects or whatever.
And reiterating a different...
reinterpreting through those lower languages to build up back to functionality.
And I mean, this is the exact function of metaphor. It's the exact function of... learning is done by like this. When you learn about parabolas, for example, right? The first time you encounter a parabola in your math class, probably one of the first things that the teacher will do is say, take a ball and you throw it. And it will go a certain speed, slowing down into this arc to a point. It will stay there, and then we'll follow the exact same arc going down in a reverse.
Sure.
And then you get the mathematical equation. And so now you have a metaphor for your x's and your y's. Like when you say x equals y equals x squared plus whatever, or minus whatever. It's a negative, but whatever. That's not the point. The point is that now you have like this 3-4 letter description associated metaphorically with
it's like
a motion that you've experienced before.
So it's like a binding of the heaven and earth into some protocol.
It's to extract one meaning from another meaning.
In memory too, like we're talking here towards the APS, like you're having an experience of the teacher showing you this and relating this value to that value. So you have a sense and a mind
but also,
kind of bound.
But also look at it from the narrative perspective. You have a narrative of a ball being thrown, for example, one of many possible narratives.
Right. So when you go to use this skill, you can think back to your metaphor that was given and reinterpret it in the current context.
But even more. Yes, but even more, you have this narrative, and you have this written down narrative, and then you have a compilation of the two into a new narrative that says, this is like that.
Right. This is
right?
The merging of the two to something bigger. You're kind of speaking a different language at that point, right?
Now compare it to what's happening with going up and down the peaks of subjectivity and arriving at different peaks with this metaphor. You have two different peaks, the way things are written, the way things are working with the ball, and then this third peak that combines the subjects of both, that talks about like motion is governed by like these equations, and then you have acceleration on top of that was a derivative.
Now you're talking about the archetype, because the first two examples are like a combination of the abstract and the concrete, and the archetype is a description of that, which holistically
that's
is
actually
meant to describe.
That's actually quite incidental, but yes,
you see it, don't you? You see it.
Yeah, it's exactly what. And you know what? We've been talking about skill like this nebulous thing that's almost impossible to realize, but I think you just nailed it right there. Is to take the concrete, to take the abstract, and figure out the phenomenological peak that is composed out of both subjects. How do you do that? That's the skill. If you don't do that, you're on the flip side on the subject of stupidity, because now you're just delineating pre-made, charlatan-made protocols out of the 4 quadrants. It doesn't matter where you land at specifically.
Right, and we're back to participant behavior, essentially, participant coherence, if you will.
And itself not bad, but much more rife with problems
Right.
because there's none of that peak connection going underneath. And I think that's a segue I didn't intend, but because we actually tried to land at uncertainty.
Right. Where were we again?
Well, I arrived at entities. I arrived at.
We were going up the
values.
language stack, basically. We
Then we have a
barely
s-
got into domain languages of the guild itself, maybe. I think that's where we're getting.
Yeah. Then you have
towards-
like what's called a service. A service
So
is
entities, values, and a service.
A service is something that it's not a feature of any particular entity. It's a feature of when one or more entities interact with each other, and it's not known to the entity what should happen.
Is this to provide like an API to an upper language, perhaps?
Yep.
Ah,
Because
how
then you
did I
have,
guess?
That's when you have the that's when you have the application services, which take the combination of services, entities, and values together and stitch them together as requests and commands, queries and commands, basically.
Hmm. So we're getting ever and ever closer to the human experience of, in this example, taking a request, running an app.
And now, because in a domain, you can have multiple queries, multiple commands, and on top of that, each domain is essentially a recursive structure. So you can have a subdomain and a subdomain and a subdomain until you get to the nitty-gritty.
Mm-hmm. And this is all called Espresso, right? I think that's going to shock a lot of people, just how many layers are stacked into it.
Yeah. I'm hoping the AI can actually give me a headway with the actual implementation there,
gonna be
because that's the
shocking.
only way to do it for me on my lonesome. So yeah, so you get this.
Stacking of domain languages.
So yes, you get these subdomains and whatever. So now you have a situation of where you need to say, okay, how do I divide my commands and queries into entities that can perform those commands and queries, right? Like, and that's where you get your context. So context will expose all the application services, so all the different commands and queries belonging
Now,
to it.
This seems like it's jumping to social. Does that reflect what's happening here?
It's getting there. It's because now you have a way to talk between domains. That's what it's setting up.
Mm-hmm.
Context set up a way to negotiate what happens at the boundary. So one context will say will present itself with commands and queries, and the other one will be like, okay,
So
I need this information, so I'm going to send this command to you.
interestingly,
you.
the development of this is basically, creating stacks of languages of increasing complexity
Yep.
to the bare minimum of what's literally required to have things normalized to such a degree that it's bare minimum, to the end result of being able to describe social structures, polymorphic economy.
Gift, but yeah.
Right. So yeah,
I'm not giving
like,
up that word that easy.
the gift economy. No, it's
I do want to have
There's a lot of power behind
little
that word,
bit like
by the way.
stick it to the in a craw kind of
because
thing.
we mentioned polymorphic earlier too. That's why I mentioned it. But
Well,
yeah, if we're
well-
talking about market economy versus gift economy, that's our appropriation of the term gift economy.
So yeah,
It is heavily influenced by how it's
market
used.
machine versus the polymorphic machine, market economy versus gift economy. That would be the dichotomous
It's fine,
element here.
but you almost could.
No, it's an acknowledged dichotomy.
You
It's not to
could say
call-
polymorphic economy if you wanted to, and it would be understood. Oh, you meant gift economy.
We no.
Why not?
Well, I mean, yeah.
See, it's okay. But
but that requires context.
the term polymorphic, yeah.
Without context, it's hard.
Doesn't help.
That's what one of the reasons for choosing one term per one concept was to shy away from bleeding with words like that, right?
Connotations.
Yeah. I mean, we're
For
not
sure.
we're not
No,
100%
I'm down
there.
with gift as a term, gift economy.
Yeah, we're not there like 100% either. Like we have what's called concept bleeding over. We have agency bleeding all over the place. So it's not like a perfect stipulation. We just
No,
haven't.
I get it.
we
I
just
appreciate
haven't
that you
had-
mentioned that.
We just haven't had a lot of reason to like clamp down.
'Cause I think a lot of people identify with the word gift economy and would know what that means. And as I said just earlier, the connotations are, we take most of them, like they're good.
I think the only issue I was taken with is like market and economy, or sorry, the machine. What the machine is and what the economy is shouldn't be conflated,
Okay, then.
because the market machine is a very distinct entity from the polymorphic machine against which it's contrasted. But the
Okay,
economic
then
market,
the word market needs to be changed there, and then market economy versus gift economy. But the type of machine, the word market, that should be changed then ideally, if we had a better word for it.
fine, we don't, and we haven't had a reason to do this until now, and we can do that or we can keep talking.
Right. Let's go. That is valid, though, I think. If there were a better word for it, I don't think there is. So we're
Not
just
yet.
acknowledging there's a collapse of the word.
And this is isn't the first case. Like I said, we're not 100% on
We've
this.
had to reuse things sometimes before, too. But
It's hard to choose out of, like I said, a set.
You're right, though.
set
If
of
we had
words.
better words, it should all be, like, when you say market, you
Unique.
should know that you're talking about the economy, not the machine.
Right.
For example. If that's how it pans out, right? But it's a process.
I think it's going to be in the word economy rather than the word market. And it's going to be in the word machine rather than the word market. We might have to take that plunge for now. Anyway,
I don't know if I like that.
let's continue on with like our formulation. So we've created more linguistic entities. We created the entity, the value. The entity is this thing that spans over time and reappears. The value is what gets reused and recreated at every moment, right? Like you don't need to carry over a value from moment to moment.
Right.
That's what's incidental to that moment, based on the values from the previous moment. So that's the difference between the two concepts as it comes through going across time through space.
Right. Can we give these languages, these sub-languages, like names to the different layers? Do you think? Because I think that would help me, because I'm losing track.
Object-oriented
Where is that? The first one?
types. You're just stuck at types.
Types. But
Aspect-oriented, subject-oriented.
there's one before that, object, wasn't there? It's like the machine code. Just the aggregates or
unstructured.
aggregations,
It's just
iterations.
no. This is all just regular procedural structured programming stuff where you do loops. So sequence is based on step-by-step instruction.
Right, but when we started talking about the languages, you first started describing one called like
Computation.
an aggregate or something, which is just
Yeah, and that's the part
If
of
you're-
that's part of computation. You do an enumeration. You
types of
enumerate.
furniture. You've got a chair. You've got this and that.
Enumeration.
Enumeration. So is that a type of language? Is that a more
No.
fundamental?
No,
That
it's-
is object oriented.
That is part of the fundamentals.
Which is object oriented. We're saying it's all based on object oriented structure. Is the fundamental.
Even object orientation itself is implementable with strict procedural concepts.
Yeah, I get that. But that implies that there's a language before that's being used to make the object-oriented language.
Computational.
Okay, so computational is our first language. Gotcha. And you did mention that before, I think.
Yeah. So I lifted
Computational, then object-oriented.
I lifted that word computational because when the guy that invented C++
Then
declared that
subject-oriented.
declared that the computational model has been solved by C, so I'm not going to change it. So that's why C++ looks like C. That's
Right.
what I'm talking
That makes
about.
sense. Yeah.
So
That's
C,
a good little
so that's like
historical
your
tidbit.
C of the language.
So computational object-oriented, subject, and then aspect, or what?
Subject
was the
and
next?
aspect are
Okay, can we call this one? Can we just call it subject-oriented?
they've never been combined into one before, so that doesn't exist.
Theoretically, does one completely imply the other? Like, can we just say if there's no
They are-
subject-oriented without aspect-oriented, or there's no aspect-oriented without subject-oriented?
Those are not true statements, but at the same time too, they have not been implemented together, mostly because they solve very similar problems, and so it was deemed confusing.
So is this like domain-oriented?
This is just before that.
Okay, so it would
This
Fine.
would still be much more fundamental, and this is a runtime polymorphism, basically.
subject, right?
Fuck. The word runtime polymorphism has also been used to talk about the compiled
And this is
time-based
like-
implied.
This like gives a flexibility to the ontology of the program itself. When normally the compiler would create this strict structure, we're allowing that process to happen in runtime as well.
Yeah, we're allowing the programmer to dictate aspects of it.
So,
So it's
Like-
aspect and subject-oriented programming all at once.
right, that would be what's familiar, but really it's like polymorphic programming or something. You could say. It's what it is. It shifts on the fly. That's kind of the idea of it, right? But so for notoriety or whatever.
Yeah, say
subject-
polymorphic programming and then mention AOP and SOP.
What's that?
Okay, so what's your second one? Did you do
Object-oriented.
So that's OOP.
Yeah.
OOP.
OOP.
And now polymorphic programming. And in brackets it's going to be SOP
Subject. Slash,
plus
or plus.
AOP.
Because they're not really the same, right? AOP. Okay.
Traditional aspect-oriented programming does not
So-
involve the aspect redeclaring what the methods of an objects are.
Polymorphic programming.
So the difference in our aspects and traditional aspects is that aspects usually do before and after actions on methods. We go a step further and say, oh no, by the way, this is also what the method is.
It affects the thing that's actually happening itself.
But if we don't do that, it's just going to use the
Okay.
previous version.
So we've got computational programming, object-oriented programming, polymorphic programming, domain-driven,
Domain-driven, test-driven.
programming,
So test-driven is the 0.5 between each of the layers.
right?
So computational plus test, right?
You would say it could be in here,
Yeah,
0.5.
you can have the 0.5 is going
Plus
to be all the
object-oriented plus 5.
0.5, yeah. So the TDD part is when you have computational constructs, you're able to set up expectations to say, if you're given these inputs, I want these outputs. Right? Expect 5 plus 5 to equal 10. That's computational. And then object-oriented is expect this class to be derived from that class. Or expect this method to return a value from the derived portion, not from the base portion.
And the expect keyword kind of brings up to mind what we're talking about with asynchronous stuff and like waiting. Is that related or not? Because you mentioned it before at that time too, when the expect command.
In this case, what we've done is we've created the
It's not related to
asynchronous
that.
part in a sequential.
No, I mean the idea that you just put off a request expecting something, but then you go about your business doing something else. right? This whole structure that we were talking about.
In this case, the expect keyword is going to
It's different.
It's going to
right?
block.
Just tell me it's different.
It's different.
Okay.
It's going to wait until whatever is thrown to come back to it and
yeah,
be
that's
like,
what you're talking about.
is what's thrown exactly what I expected? Somehow, whether it's async, sync,
Oh, okay.
whatever.
And only if it is what's expected, then do something.
Fail or proceed. If it's not expected, fail. If it's expected, proceed.
Right.
And
Makes
that's
sense.
And if you don't cover all of your code with expectations, fail. So that means you can't even produce a running program until every single expectation is accounted for. So if your program is going to be doing something that you don't test for, and you run all of your expectations and it doesn't hit that piece of code ever, it's going to be like, well, I've never executed here. What are your expectations here if it does happen? And that way it's going to be like, you can't compile me. I don't know what you want.
Right.
I mean, I can understand what you want linguistically, but if you say the sentence out loud, are you making fucking sense?
No, I heavily agree with the idea of having like guiding principles to a program, to having this sort of heaven to the earth being the code itself executing.
Well,
but
it's also a reflection of demand and supply.
so, and we've kind of summed this up as we call it point 5, being that every layer of language, whatever we call it, say computational is 1,
Yeah.
object-oriented is 2, polymorphic is 3. Each of these has a point 5, you could say, in which
You can set up expectations.
you could start creating a very structured program.
Expectations, basically. That's what it's called. Or specifications through the script of
Now-
describing expectations.
We have 1, 2, 3 languages. I thought we only
So
did
now-
3, so we keep going. It's expanding.
So
then.
so now we're at the two tops. So the next one is we're using we're making entities, we're making values, we're making all of these different things to describe what's called a domain.
And this is the polymorphic programming we're into, right? With the entities. We've skipped over object-oriented now, and we're into polymorphic.
Polymorphic programming is included with subjects and aspects.
Oh, actually, no, we've gone beyond that. Now we're into domain
Exactly.
with the entity stuff.
So entities, entities, values, services, and all of that are implemented through using underlying subjects, aspects, types, and all
Okay,
that.
okay. So what are we calling this one? Domain what?
Domain driven.
Domain-driven, that-
Usually
that'd
it's
be
called
the-
domain driven design, but in this case it's not
Correct.
even it's not a design. It's more like a domain language.
Yeah, we could, if we have the word domain there, I think we could probably change.
So representational programming. Because at this point, when we're starting to do a domain, we're representing something outside of computation itself.
Right. That's a very good distinction.
So and for us, the domain is the guild.
And so this is the first step that we take where we're really acknowledging that the purpose of this language is to describe, as part of a map, something that is the territory or the terrain across this threshold of meaning, if you will.
Yeah, across
where,
various contexts.
Where heaven meets earth, so to speak.
In some way. Where subjectivity is a runtime feature, and it can change based on the execution of where the program is at. So if the context changes for it, the meaning of what the code changes for it, and so on and so forth.
And okay, this is the first time that we're really simulating an existing thing, the entity. We're sort of simulating something through time, which is really a trippy sort of representation.
Not only is it moving through space and time, but the observer of the thing that is moving through space and time is changing, and so the meaning of that movement changes accordingly.
So, do you like the word like representational programming?
I think that's the best one I've got so far.
can we mention anything towards domain, because that's what people understand, but
So what I can explain what you would be doing. You would be creating entities, named entities. So the thing that moves through time.
like
You'd be
we're
you'd be-
representing domains, right? Sort of, you could say.
Yeah.
Domain is like an
and
environment.
a representation of a domain is an introduction of nouns and verbs
Like,
into the language.
I like that. Representational programming sounds amazing, but I just wish there was an easier, better sounding way to say like representation, like domain representational programming or representational
So,
domain programming.
The current
But those don't sound good.
The current nomenclature for this is domain-driven design,
Right.
and that
The
sounds
triple D.
fugly as fuck.
Right. So
So if we were to build in domain-driven design into the very language itself, what kind of programming will we be doing? And to me, that sounds like we are representing whatever the domain is.
right.
Hence the choice.
Not
for-
that programming hasn't always been about representing something.
Right. It's
But
driven.
this language itself is aiming to create that map in
representation.
runtime, a map to something that exists.
a literal paradigm of representation.
To something that exists, quote unquote.
Whereas this is a very
Right.
polymorphic paradigm, this is a representational paradigm. But it is really just domain-driven design. And then, of course, you have the 3.5, which is setting up all of the expectations for whatever domain language produces. So, if you have aggregates,
4.5.
if you have aggregates, for example, you shouldn't be able to access the underlying entities inside the aggregate without the aggregate itself. So things like that
You should be able to?
should not.
Should not.
So now we arrive at we have enough of a layer medium to start building the guild language.
Mm-hmm.
That's the domain. So that's our 4.
Right.
Language number what? 5?
Correct.
So, moving down the logical steps, what we're doing is we're creating a nomenclature for the domain. So we have member, we have natural, we have network, we have proximity, we have the different kinds of proximities, we have the different kinds of natural guilds.
You're talking about the fundamental guilds.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have a membership guild, and then like nomenclature of entities and aggregates and all of that to represent that. Like members, for example, would be an entity, a member.
Okay, so I just want to
In
note...
the networking guild, a member means something very different. It means something that can connect to anybody else. And in the membership guild, it's just like it's the fact that it has access to the networking guild to begin with, right? Like, so the different contexts are set up for the different
I getcha.
guilds. And so a context is set up for all the natural guilds. A context is set up for different contextual different.
Okay, now this is getting very interesting. So it sounds like, so let's say 4 languages here so far: computational, object-oriented, polymorphic, and representational.
Up until then, we can just do about any kind of representation.
Right. And
Once
now,
we get into the
but
guild,
now we're jumping into, so that we're going from, and I think so we're jumping now from Espresso into using Espresso to write the guild. Correct? Right? So
yeah, this is a different beast.
I just wanted to note that we're really jumping here, because from what we've discussed so far is like could be a product in its own, and I think that if we develop this properly,
So the reason is
there's going to be demand part and parcel with the guild itself.
So the reason to get into Espresso to begin with, right, is because anything in existence right now doesn't have any of the features put together in this way.
Right, all together.
right? So
It's like there's little pieces here and there.
espresso is really not a new thing. It's an aggregation of everything that's been tried so far.
But what it is, in my mind, is the emergence of a higher language, if you will, which is taking in once again the fundamentals of lower language, which is what we do. We build and try to find out what works, and eventually it all comes together and something emerges.
It's to give the higher language a medium that it can easily pattern, right? Because if your language is stuck with just procedural programming, it's much more difficult to pattern that to do this. If your language is only object oriented, it's still just there's so much more extra work to do to pattern this.
What you're saying is people have used these existing languages probably to do what we're talking about already, and that's how it works.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about creating this framework that makes it so that you can only speak in the languages that make sense this way.
That you would use those languages in this way in the first place.
Yeah, without even knowing it necessarily.
Exactly. And I mean, syntax sugar exists in languages already. And this is what this is. It's called syntax sugar. It means you write something down in your source file.
Mm-hmm. And many things happen below it in speaking in the lower languages.
And it gets retranslated and retranslated until it fits the patterns of those lower layers in the computational sense. Mm-hmm. So when you create an entity, it knows to write a class, it knows to write a subject, it knows to write an aspect, it knows to...
Mm-hmm. Even if they're just filled with the word default for half their properties or whatever.
Right, which you can override easily by guiding the damn thing. If you if you provide the correct guidance to the process, then it's seamless. It's like that statement from Futurama. If you do things right, it's almost like you've done nothing, right? And it should seem exactly like that.
Right. It's like playing bass in the band.
Yeah, you just sound like you're a part of the drums. Usually.
Oh, everybody knows when you fucked up.
Because you didn't follow the drums.
Other than that, no, not that. Like rhythm and all that. You have to stick with the rhythm, or not rhythm, but
so let's follow the
chord structure, etc.
So let's follow this thought to the end, because it's actually we're pretty close. We are going to create a nomenclature out of the domain language for the guild language.
Right.
That's what we would call it.
We're taking this step now away from what we could call the product espresso, where you're now just assuming that and using it, and we're using it to write
the next layer,
the guild language.
Yeah. So that's like nomenclature about the member. It's nomenclature about the natural guilds and all of the and all of the stacking that goes on in there. It's the nomenclature about the network and how that works.
And we've defined this in the past as fundamental guilds. So there's 3 of them. There's membership, network, and mediation, or right?
Network. Membership,
something
mediation,
like
networking. So those are the 3 guilds. So immediately you can understand that there would probably be things like subjects or services or entities of that nature that are called these things. And how does membership serve you? How does mediation serve you, right? But then whatever they serve you with is another guild.
Now hold
on.
on.
How does a guild serve you in general?
When I just want to clarify, services, was this related to the same language layer as entity and value? Service and application?
So
because I remember you started talking about those.
A service
back.
A service is when you need to do stuff with either more than one entity. Like how do 2 entities interact together? Like what does that mean to them? Because they don't always interact this way. It's not it's not necessarily at their natural environment per se. They don't know how to respond to this input. Oh, this input means just change yourself like this, and like this, and like this.
What I'm hearing here is that in this layer, the representational, we're allowing different entities to come together into one service, but the entities themselves being like
it's very self-contained.
The pieces coming together to build something bigger for a language above that to take advantage of.
So and then
As a service, what a service means is like you give it a soundbite and it gives you a soundbite.
so an entity is an authority of how it will change its own self based on the inputs that it gets.
Right.
It's the final authority. A service has no authority over that, but it can negotiate the inputs between. So
Wait,
if this
did you say application? Was that first? What was the first term? Not entity.
an application is a way to
But what is getting changed in itself? I didn't get what was labeled there.
okay, in a service. So an entity will have the authority to negotiate. If I get this input, this is how I change. This is how I adapt to it. Basically, it tells you that. So whenever you send a message to an entity, it just goes, okay, I'll change
Interesting.
based on that message, and you don't get a control over how I do that. A service, on the other hand, has no state. Right?
A service, the entity is to conform to it, essentially.
The
As
service
a
says, okay,
provider.
your response. The service says, okay, you're the authority of how you change your state, sure, but this is how I'm going to negotiate state changes with you. I'm going to send you this message, that message, the following message, and it could extract the values for all of those messages from using other entities. Say like, hey, what's your ID here? What's your object over here? What's that ID? What's that name? Like, you know what I mean? It could query through the entity and
again, you need to be able to find out what the state is, or ask out into the void, because this is a runaway process potentially.
So a service can be like, okay, cool, I have this information to work with. I need to use this information to retrieve some entity over here and some entity over there. I need to use this information to extract a value from this entity and then pass it over to this operation of this entity. So service coordinates all of those different pieces of the puzzle together while having no authority of having to say of what that means to each of the entities. The entity is responsible for knowing, oh, if I receive a call with these values, that's what I'm going to do with it. The rest of you can fuck off.
And again, this service, I'm just visualizing like an interface towards upper languages, as in a control panel.
It's like a context.
A control panel or buttons that you can press. A service is something you feed data into this hole, push a button, pull a lever, and then something below happens.
Yeah, and then it accesses the database, and the entities come alive and then do their thing because the service pushed the information through. And so the entire thing is then encapsulated by another service layer called the application. And this service layer is only responsible for figuring out which services and entities are going to do the operation. So the most it can do is select a couple of services, a couple of entities based on inputs, run the service code together, maybe get results and run it through some other services together again, but it's not responsible for knowing what the fuck the services are doing. So the application is a fulfillment of a request from the outside.
I'm sort of seeing this as another piece on top, like what I was just talking about, the buttons and control panels, where the service being like that to the entities, the application being like that to the services as a collection. We're just abstracting, basically.
The applications.
We're adding complexity.
So
facilities.
So when you have an app, like an app, like an executable, it should be thought of as a collection of application services. Each application service is either a query into the application or a command into it to change its state. Query extracts information out from the state. Command changes state. So
interesting. And where is that? The application properties of application.
So each query, each command is an application. The application
Yeah, I get it.
makes use of services and entities
And it's kind of like in DOS.
to do its thing.
In the DOS days, you type in, game.exe with some variables and hit enter. That's like going into the system and it just starts changing the state of the computer.
Or Linux right now.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. Like the application is your command.
Application as a kind of implied running thing.
Yeah.
Obviously.
So,
right?
so your executable is actually an aggregation of what's called application services. Application services' whole duty is to take external input in, transform it into a way that the internal services and entities understand, take the service,
Right.
take the service and or
this is
entity
obvious.
response.
This is all obvious as a layer because you have your entities are essentially your true unit of of that language, that domain language, and above it you have apps which interface up. Below it you have the
And the app takes a signal in.
not entities below that.
So an app can take.
You know what I'm saying though, right?
Yeah.
Like the entity is a neutral floating thing which is being taken care of by
Yeah.
one element which goes up and one element which goes down, and that's a perfectly described language.
And so the application acts as a membrane here, in that it takes the input, which could be like just your regular HTTP request, for example, or a query from a database or whatever. If you're a database and that's your domain, you're going to get a query string, for example. If you're an HTTP server, you're going to get a query string, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what I mean, like a request response body and all of that shit. And all you're doing in that layer, it's a very thin membrane, is like you transform it into into the domain language that it is.
Mm-hmm.
And because this is the request, you need such and such service to accomplish it, such and such entities to accomplish that. You bring those pieces together. What they give you back, you send as a signal out, in the same way you got it in. So it's kind of like a very thin translation layer for taking, like, for example, a different way of representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And doing something with it and
this
coming back
reminds
out with
me
a
of
representation
like
that's
computation itself and like the translation between domains, and it's obvious that would be the upper section of this language, this domain.
So if you think about all of these apps ending at shooting HTTP strings at each other, right? And they're all doing the same thing, it's almost like they're just using text to talk to each other.
Right, and then we have an economy.
So that's the guild. So that's the guild. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build a domain language for all the different aspects of the guild. We call that the guild, and that's the language. And then we're trying to take that nomenclature
So
and try to define our archetypes.
we've got, let's say, about another 15 minutes or so before we got to book it out of here.
Yep.
Looks like about
Okay.
that time, being all responsible and all that.
Yeah.
So in that time we have, bit.
Are we at language 6?
Well, here's the thing: I got lost at language 4,
Okay.
and then so representational programming we called it, domain-driven design.
So
So number 5, we were talking about the guild, right? So
yeah.
what are we calling this? Like, we haven't really sat
This
down
language
and-
is the guild.
It's called the guild. That's the.
Or you can call it guild programming if you want. There's no name that I've come up with before. This is because this is emergent. I have not really thought about how to lay it down. DDD, for
I
example,
like the idea of a language.
is done. DDD was a done deal, so this was easy. I've just called it something else.
Yeah. Right.
This, the guild, is
It's more organizational.
it's more organic. Because
it's
we're moving
it's social and organizational. So those are two words.
The jump is that it's not a domain driven design. It's a domain onto itself. So it's a domain language.
Right. That's kind of the idea. Like,
So domain programming will probably be it. You have a domain, now you program it. The domain is your medium.
okay, so we're saying what's been called DDD up until this point is actually representational, and this is how to describe an actual domain in terms of behavior and environment. Like, we're claiming domain for layer 6 here, or 5. See what I'm saying? Like,
I want to call it functional, except the fact that functional programming has already been taken.
of course, functional, but organizational, social, that's what's striking to me. These are terms we already have discussed, but do you see what I'm saying? We're like,
Pragmatic. Pragmatic application of domains.
protocol, it does feel very pragmatic.
Right, it's because like it's the wax on wax off situation, right? Your language of wax on wax off has been defined by the domain. You've done that. So waxing on
So
and off have been
wax
defined.
programming.
So in the domain part, in the representational part, you have waxing, you have on, and you have off. In this next layer, you have wax on, wax off. The actual protocol
Right.
programming.
I get you.
It's protocol programming, and I'm out of beer.
Protocol programming. I like that.
Like, I mean, it doesn't.
Protocol, the word itself very much implies a thing, a behavior related, which I
Contextualized. Contextualized too, because you don't have a protocol without context.
Let's try that. Protocol programming, contextual programming, context programming.
Maybe.
Seagulls going nuts, I think.
That's seagulls?
I bet. They got somehow the building over there. I think they started banging, like with burning propane to bang them away, and I think they put a net up on the roof. Maybe they don't. I might have just been hearing stuff, but the seagulls find no home on that building, and they're fucking all over the place now. Like, it's crazy.
Why the fuck are they here? There's no water. Anyway.
I don't know. So protocol programming sounds interesting to me, obviously.
And I like this example of wax on, wax off because it makes it so fucking simple. In domain programming,
It is protocol is the essence of what we're using. It's the archetype
On-
of what's going on, isn't
on
it?
is a value, right?
Sure.
Off is a value.
Mm-hmm.
Wax is an entity. Waxing. Waxing can either be on, can either be off. Forget about who's doing the waxing. We don't have to paint the entire
Right.
picture.
Part of an entity.
Yeah, we can shorten the program. We don't need.
It's fine.
We don't need a waxer to have waxing.
Sure.
Right? So waxing can either be on or off, and that's the entity, and the values are on or off.
Right.
So when you're waxing on, your next phase is off.
Right.
When you're waxing off, your next phase is on. On, off, on. That's the entire domain. The entire domain, right?
Okay. Right.
So, the job of the protocol part is to encode when you wax on, you wax off. When you wax off, you wax on. So the representational part,
Unless finished. If finished, then don't wax on again.
we're not even considering that. This is an infinite.
Okay.
loop.
Fine. Waxing on and off forever.
We don't need a real life scenario. We need an
No, and this reminds me of
understandable
the
one.
interesting part about this espresso language is that you can call waxing an entity, and it will fill in the entity, assuming, okay, there's something behind this that's doing it. I don't care. Now I have waxing on and off. Right? I like that. That's a language
And-
that I can get behind
and-
because I always screw up programming,
and
and it gives
underneath-
me all kinds of errors.
And underneath that, you can imagine like you are waxing on, and the only method you're trying to call is next step. In the subject
Right.
of waxing on, the next step is waxing off.
So you've waxed on, now what?
So the subject will basically do. The subject can do one of two things. It can build up, wax on, wax off, activate on, activate off, activate on, activate, and build up an entire stack. But if you're clever and a programmer, you'll notice that it's just switching in place. It doesn't matter if on preceded off or off preceded on. That's not part of your issue.
Yeah.
So what you can do is inside the on subject,
Once it's done.
create the off subject and replace yourself. So it happily exits the subject and be like, what's my next step?
Right, and this is within the entity of waxing, just shifting its shape.
And the outside world could never know, potentially.
Very cool. So I feel like we've really gone over what we did last time, like really in more detail. I feel like we've connected things in a more logical, rational order, and I've sat here being the dumb non-programmer asking questions, and it seems like we've done some pretty good damage here today. And we have left forward to look to basically guild protocol programming, which describe how the guild itself is described, and then within that, this system of offices and all that, which is the next kind of domain.
So basically, we've left the realm of defining a domain to using a domain as a way to define further domains expressed based on those things.
As you naturally would, so that this becomes a language enabling other languages to stack on top of it. Once again, we're seeing that pattern.
And potentially we have, like with previous concepts, like for example, types can be extended, right? So in a domain that
by having different subjects activate, the types change.
So if you can implement an idea, this is just thinking out there. But if you implement an idea of a domain extending a domain, for example, you can lift a lot of the heavy working from the previously defined domain and just like add to it or change it somewhat, or and just keep going that way.
Now that becomes very dangerous, quote unquote.
But
when a domain itself changes that you're depending on and you expect it to work one way and it doesn't.
But this danger is exactly the same danger that you get with aspects and subjects. So you're not really getting involved into a new problem. You're getting involved into the same problem in a very high stake way.
Now the way to tackle this is through these 0.5 programs, the testing programs, which is the testing aspect to that layer of language, which kind of imposes sort of human readable understanding of what should be happening into a testing scenario.
For example, one of its stipulations could be like, you have to give me an example of this happening under every single subject activation. Like if you don't give me the idea of what will happen if you activate it and all of these subjects combined this way, I can't let you proceed to knowing that this is a well-formed program. Like you're missing something. Unless you specify somehow you want this.
This reminds me of like, that sounds like a really good qualifier. It reminds me of like if an incident happens and you want to change behavior in a domain, you explain, okay, don't do it this way, do it that way, but without anybody getting offended. Look, this happened before. This actual incident of thing happening, which is what you're requesting to be loaded up, is the reason why instead of doing it the way you're doing it, we have to do it this way. You know what I'm saying? Like to communicate to another, say, employee or a coworker or a friend, look, this isn't done this way because this literally happened. So to pull that all into a code, you need to pull in the experience itself.
I'll give you another more technical version of this. So we were talking about the peaks, right? And how like you can have a third peak that comes up as an amalgamation of all the peaks
Right.
that have come up before it, or something to that effect. So
Right.
what the testing suite can do is, like, you say you introduce a new subject with aspects in it. It could be like, you have test cases for every combination except for.
Right. So it's just
Right.
iterating through.
So if you have all of these subjects, it will try to combine all the different subjects in a different combination and be like, where's
Yeah.
the test case for this?
Right. So
What's the expectation there?
this it seems generic, but so this is part of the programming that would come with the point 5 language suite to iterate through what's been written on the 1 point, or the numerical point, the 2 point, what's been written there and provided, iterate through that and say, do the test cases really reflect what's been written as far as the things that can happen?
Yeah.
Has it been all taken care of?
Yeah, and if you get to a situation where a single bit of code has not even been executed at all,
Right.
you can be like, what will happen if that happens?
Right.
And what it will try to do is, like, use all the subject combinations internally to. So, if you don't want specific subject combinations to even be valid, you write that in. So, like, for example,
Mhm.
you don't want
Right,
this.
right, right.
It's telling you, I can't figure out what you want to do with this combination, and you will be like, okay, in my test, this combination is invalid. But in order to make this test pass, I have to actually mark this combination of subjects invalid in the language.
Acknowledged in the test language, like the point 5 side.
So
of
the
things.
test language could say, like, that's invalid, but at the same time, your normal language has to reflect that to be an invalid situation. So as soon as you try to
so
hit
you're
it,
talking about probably modifying the code a bit to actually incorporate and say, this is out of range. Don't accept a value here.
right?
Because this
If you're expecting an array of only 1 to 10,
yeah.
and
So
you get an array of 1,500 values,
that makes sense. That's how you would avoid probably a lot of like potential exploits and dangers like tax and all
And
that.
so all of that has to be set up as expectations.
Yep.
Now I gotta go.
Well, I guess shall we come back in 5 and give her a 5? We got a bit of time
Less
here,
than.
tiny bit of time, but just in case we manage to wrap this up, yeah, we're just going to take a little quick break here. Apologies once again for the noise. It is what it is, and we are very thankful to have great facilities, and actually this is an awesome spot, but we will be right back. Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Although, interesting, we didn't really get that far. We did get very far, though. We got into the guild language, as we were calling it. Now we're calling it protocol language. And then
because it can encompass other protocols, not necessarily the guild.
Right. Correct. Exactly. But well, okay. So we may even that may even be yet another language. So we may put guild on top of that. However, anyways, past that.
No.
yeah,
It's a way to talk between guild and other domains. So the domain descriptive language is a way to negotiate switching between domains. So one domain is the guild, the other is, say, woodworking.
Right, but we were saying
Or gardening, or
almost
whatever.
like a special domain itself is the protocol domain in which we establish domains. Sort of. So we've had representational, which is where we had domain-driven design.
Yeah.
Representational. On top of that, protocol programming, which seemed to involve this social organizational higher aspect.
So
which
that's,
may or may not be the guild itself.
that-
We could say yes, this is
no,
the
no,
guild.
no, that's the details of the protocol. So in the gardening domain, the protocol is this. In the guild domain, the protocol is that.
Right.
But in the domain, representational part, we can do what's called a transformation or a mapping. We can do a mapping between domains. So the guild domain can map to the gardening domain and vice versa in the representational layer. That's the layer that takes care of the mappings. So that way you can transform a pattern in higher level
Right.
here using the same fundamental layer to a more significant layer over here in this domain.
Okay.
So this is the language that takes
Because
care of the mappings.
The protocol itself is simply waiting for a certain
Context.
a certain event to happen, and then respond with certain program.
Right. So
Sort of.
protocols.
Right. So that event you can have that sitting there and translate any other event to trigger a yes on this event.
Yeah. So events are context domain dependent.
Right. Of course. You have the
Like,
thing
so
doing the
an
thing
event
or
in
whatever.
this domain and the same event in that domain could mean two different things.
Or you could say they're equivalent, and then one will trigger the other. Right. That's what you're talking about. The translation.
There is a mapping between domains.
That would be the map. Right.
Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the representational language takes care of defining domains and transferring representation.
I can see that as a
between
lower
domains.
level function, right?
Now,
And-
within the domains themselves, you'll have things like the guild language, the gardening language, the woodworking language. Because
Right.
that's what domains define.
And so before that, we have this protocol language, I think, itself, which is like describing this event program relationship as like,
Well, this is where it gets fun. The protocol language is actually the very underlying computational language, out of which everything else is built. So, you never sent a piece of data you cannot interpret. Doesn't matter
Right.
what domain you're in, you're using that language to you go all the way down and all the way back up. And that's reflected in our
that's
car
an
diagram.
interesting way of saying strange loop isomorphism,
Well, that's the car diagram.
right? But
Not only-
oftentimes we repackage data and just send it on its way.
Yeah,
without
with the
understanding.
middle agent being very passive, but the middle agent could be very active in translating. So this would be like things like in your brain making metaphors, for example, or the phenomenological step between two different peaks.
This has been just a wild meeting. Pretty awesome. I love that I felt some uncertainty with our last meeting, but we've just gone over everything again, and we've now more concretely stepped up to this plate. I think of what we're about to talk about, programming the offices and uncertainty, which unfortunately we didn't get to, but I think we laid the foundation.
Well, I can give the
Pretty
preview.
good.
I can give the preview if you want.
Sure.
Because we arrived at the point of where we're talking about the guild language, right? So we did that by using the representational language to represent the guild.
We're talking about fundamental guilds, etc.
Right, which which introduces new nomenclature like members, network, natural guild,
Right.
education, and all of those that type of different things. And now we're trying to talk about the offices.
And the offices are built on top of that.
So the first thing we have to do is define a layer of uncertainty for the reflection of the actual fundamental layer. And we have to use that to build up the fundamental layer itself first. And the way we built it up is going to reflect on each layer. So what we're going to have to do is build
Are you talking about what's
stack.
fundamental guilds?
Sorry,
or
no, sorry. The primordial
we're talking about uncertainty.
The primordial archetypes.
Right, starting with uncertainty.
Starting with that uncertainty, we define uncertainty, and we go in two directions. Up to build on that with entropy,
Right, up the stack.
and then horizontally towards the office space, what that uncertainty means. We're also going to have
Right,
to do
two dimensions, if you will.
and we're also going to have to do something when we get to the personal stack to feed back into the uncertainty and the layers that follow up from that stack. Do you know what I mean? So
You mean at the top of the personal, there's the orange boxes, like or wait, at the top of it's top of primordial stack, isn't it? Machine, human,
yeah,
all that. That's where you're talking about recursive downing back up to the other stacks.
so what we're going to end up doing is something along the lines of tacking onto the language. So you know how the language started with types, and then subjects and aspects can be interpreted in terms of types. We're going to do the same thing in this layer, in that the guild language is going to feed into the uncertainty language. The uncertainty language is going to feed into the entropy and the rest of the primordial archetypes.
Right.
It's going to feed directly into the corresponding layers in the personal,
And-
corporate, and then state.
So I just want to say we're talking
Archetypes.
about constructing protocols here, right? Like the construction of the offices
It's going to go through a
can be
feedback loop.
constituted as at least partially recording of protocols in media. Like we should be able to see actual protocols, should we
Yes.
not at this point?
So this is how this
So that could
protocols
be
are going to
maybe
be
next.
built up. So
Maybe
there's going to be a
next,
demand.
next
There's-
meeting.
So there's going to be a demand.
Right.
So the first demand
Right.
is uncertainty. The next demand will be twofold. The next demand will be personal, and it will be
And
entropy.
You're talking about like kind of a universal demand, just almost imposed.
So the demand of uncertainty is going to demand language for entropy. The demand of uncertainty is also going to demand language for the personal office.
Interesting. I hadn't considered these like kind of.
So you build the language of
Paths.
entropy, you build the language of space-time, you build the language of matter, you build the language of...
Yeah, like I get that
So on
we're
and
starting
so
from
on.
fundamentals and moving to more significant.
And we can pause at this time until we reach all the way to the personal, until we imbued the next offices.
Okay, right?
But
Like
we
the
can-
corporate and state
So we can,
stacks.
so whatever we end up here with is going to be added to the language across every layer.
I think I get what you're saying.
So we develop a layer above, we transpose. We develop a layer across, we transpose.
You seem to be.
And then once we reach the personal across this stack, well, now we have all of this language to imbue all of these stacks with as well. So that's going to bleed over, spill over, if you will. And then we're gonna
it's
do
like
that
it's
again.
like adding subjects, kind of, isn't it?
And then we're going to reiterate across,
feedback, observation, incorporation. Right?
Mhm.
Like, because we can't leave it at that.
'Cause you don't want to have to go into a totally different area of the program. You just want to add subjects to what's going on already,
Well,
right?
because for example, the personal archetype that imbues this entire column needs to now speak to every single layer, from uncertainty right back up to its incarnation
Of course.
in the primordial archetypes. And then you do the same thing over again, twice over, for the corporation, because the corporation incorporates the personal. So all the personal stuff, that's why it doesn't get neglected.
And you're also talking about maintaining that strange loop isomorphism here. Like that's part and parcel.
it all starts with the language of uncertainty, and then every single archetype is its own language.
But I
It's its
mean,
own
even
language.
even the fact that we're looking at different stacks coming on top of each other, sort of, right? Like the personal is sitting there, then you can add corporate and state sort of on top of that. But it's the same thing. You're just adding new subjects, right?
Yeah, and every time you have to add one of those new things, you have to be like, go back to your original incarnation of the language and be like, okay, so now I don't have just these ways to delineate, I have these higher level. So it's like with types, all of a sudden you have like subjects and aspects, right? Like so much more elaborate than a raw type.
Right.
So all you're doing is imbuing and imbuing and imbuing and imbuing.
Yeah, and,
So
and
the
very
the
interestingly,
next layer is imbuing the previous.
it's a process of normalization where you
and
you
diversification at the
condense
same time.
your map, you condense your language, the words spoken, down to the bare absolute minimum, which accomplishes some sort of whole goal to create a whole on edit level, if you will. And then on top of that, that's where like this method of expansion of description of through language, of stacking and layers, using Linux type of methodology or philosophy, where you have little bite pieces each doing their own
It's
part.
a way to view the narrative as a stretched out wave across time, so that you can pick out the note it's depicting. That original idea for uncertainty principle. You know how you can't take the pitch of a clap because the frequency happens in such a short time. You only have too few peaks to isolate from it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
Well,
if you have more peaks to isolate from, you can determine the pitch.
If you want to figure out what's the shape of the electron cloud for a particular molecule,
it's the same idea.
particular atom, you would take recording after recording after recording. Eventually, you get a picture, right? That's what you're
Yeah, so
talking
you have
about.
to stretch it out over time to get any accuracy. But if you want,
Dustman.
but if you want any like,
We're just angering Zhenya's wife right now by being late because it's 5 o'clock. But yeah, we're pretty much wrapping up. What are you saying?
we gotta go.
We gotta go. So we're peacing out. Dustman makes a 1 second appearance.
I'm right in time.
Yep.